All right. Thank you everyone for joining us for OWASP Vancouver. We have some very cool talks today. I'm speaking, so it's been a while since I've done a talk at OWASP Vancouver. It's mostly been workshops recently. And then we have David Scribonia. He'll be talking after me. I'm going to be talking a little bit about self-serve threat modeling. So how we redefined how threat modeling looks within our own organization at Segment. And what am I trying to sell here? Like we keep talking about how security is everyone's responsibility. So I'm trying to sell a plan to actually make it everyone's responsibility and sort of to reduce the anxiety and the stress that the security team has just within their system. So I usually start things with a quote, and I decided to be a little bit cheeky. Today, this presentation may positively impact your developer's velocity and improve their code quality. So definitely use the information from this presentation at your own risk. I should also caution you that my younger son might barge in at any point. He tends to do that whenever there's important meetings going on. So that's the FYI for you. Okay. So what's the agenda? We're going to cover, I want to make sure that we're on the same page. We'll cover what threat modeling is. Then we'll talk a little bit about what self-serve threat modeling, what I think it is philosophically. We'll do a deep dive into the program that we've set up. And I'll talk to you about some things that went well and some things that we had challenges with the program. And then sort of the next steps for me and for the future of this program. Who am I? I'm Jeevan Singh. I'm a guy that did a ton of development and then switched over to the security side. I've been in the security space for some time now, but more importantly, I really enjoy talking to others about security. The community did a lot for me as I grew in the security space, and I love giving back and helping build other folks as well. So I help run OWASP Vancouver. We've recently had AppSec Pacific Northwest. I'm really good at annoying my family because I like to talk about risk. Having said that, I could not have predicted the toilet paper shortages that at the beginning of the pandemic. I definitely didn't foresee that. So that's a little black mark on my risk assessments there. Okay. So I don't really want to talk too much about threat modeling, but I did want to just, again, cover the basics so that we're on the same page. The goal of what is threat modeling? So I feel that the goal of threat modeling is fairly straightforward. The goal is to identify the assets in your system and then thinking about the various threats or risks to that asset. Once we understand the risks, then it's sort of possible for us to think about how you can defend that asset, how you can defend that system against those risks. So at the very base, threat modeling should be simple, should be transparent, and should be democratized. Like everyone needs to have a voice and so that you have a robust threat model. So threat modeling is important for many, many reasons. One is security is embedded in the design phase. So a lot of folks talk about shifting left, and doing threat modeling is really shifting left. You're talking about security in the design phase. And it also means that you can fix vulnerabilities before you actually write a single line of code. This really makes your systems very robust, and it really protects against the vulnerabilities. I love threat modeling because I get to discover assets. It's always good to know what your assets are when you're architecting a solution. So when you call out what the assets are, you start thinking more about its resiliency, those assets' resiliency, and how to sort of defend them to attack or to even mistakes with the design. Threat modeling really helps prioritize your remediation efforts. So when you threat model, you're going to discover problems within your system. When you discover those problems in your system, you can be able to use existing design patterns, security design patterns to resolve those problems and help reduce those attack surfaces. For me personally, I love the next one is like documentation. Before I was a security engineer, I was an engineer. I really didn't like documentation. I really like coding. But on the security side, I really like documentation now. So I love having a paper trail of threat models. So when I joined Segment, I looked around and discovered a ton of different older threat models, and it gave me a real good understanding of the systems, how we think about security, how we think about risks, and how we think about remediations. So it really helped me onboard a lot very quickly. Also, threat models go stale. So documenting these threat models means that you get a chance to look at them in the future and sort of figure out if some of the assumptions that you made in the past are still valid assumptions. And it's okay, like things do go stale, and that's perfectly fine. But you want to be able to look and see if you need to reflect and change the way that you thought about that particular system. It's a great tool for security researchers. So if you are more open to it and you want to share your threat model with security researchers, they can sort of pick apart your thoughts, your assumptions, what your risks are, and then they can validate them. So maybe you had made some interesting assumptions about how to access a particular system, and they can validate either that your assumption was incorrect or if it was correct. So having a threat modeling document is great for that. It might even be a compliance requirement, like you might have to do security. I prefer doing security for the sake of security, but I'm even happy to do security for the sake of compliance as long as it gets done. So threat modeling isn't all flowers and rainbows. Setting up a strong threat modeling program is difficult. It's really difficult. So all the great things that we talk about threat modeling, they're great, but they're really hard to implement. And it can take years for someone to become good at threat modeling. So I know me and my journey, it took me a while to really understand how to do threat modeling and how to do it properly. And if it takes time for an individual to get good at it, you know that within companies, there might not be too many people that are really good at it. So when there's very few people that are good at it, they may become blockers as part of the development process. So it can potentially slow down developer velocity. And we sort of mentioned that threat models get stale. So like after a year, the assumptions that you made may not be valid assumptions. And security folks can miss things. I know that I've got my horse blinders on. I'm really good at the things I'm good at, but the things that I'm not really good at. So making sure that it could be a challenge with respect to threat modeling. Okay, so that's what I believe threat modeling is. What is self-serve threat modeling? And is it better than threat modeling? Well, first, we sort of want to figure out what are the type of problems that we're trying to solve for. So we know that threat modeling is hard to scale. We know that development gets blocked by security. And we feel that AppSec engineers should be focusing on the most important tasks. So threat modeling is hard to scale because there's only a few people that actually know how to do threat modeling well within an organization. If the company grows, the issue can get worse because there might not be the right scale. You might not bring in as many folks that can threat model properly. And as that organization scales, there might be fewer and fewer and fewer folks that can help unblock development. So if there's only a few choices that can be made by the security team. Either the security team kills himself by threat modeling everything and they're running ragged on that, which is not a realistic option. You don't want to burn out your security team. Devs get blocked and they have to wait for security, which is not great for security culture within an organization. Or security will have to pick and choose the things that you want to threat model. So you won't get to threat model all the things. And AppSec folks should really be able to focus on the most important tasks within the organization. So, and it could include just threat modeling. You might decide that the most important thing is for you to threat model all of the most sensitive areas. But there might be other things that are more important than threat modeling internal tool. Maybe you should be focusing your time on your bug bounty program or running more pen tests. So you want, in a utopian world, you want the AppSec engineers just to focus on the most riskiest things within an organization. So what is self-serve threat modeling? Well, in a self-serve threat modeling world, in the utopian security world, developers are going to do the vast majority of threat modeling without security even being present or part of the process. That means that they will identify the assets, they will understand the risks to those assets, they'll prioritize those risks, and they will mitigate them. And that should be done all on their own, and it will help improve the design considerably. Security's focus should be on training engineers to get better at threat modeling. So security should be continuously revising their training, making sure that the engineers are getting better and better at threat modeling, putting out new training every year, having higher levels of training every year. So you want to make sure that that's happening as part of the process. And it's a great way to scale the security team to the size of the organization. So if all the developers know how to threat model, doesn't matter if you have 100 engineers or if you have 10,000 engineers, when everyone knows how to threat model, the engineering teams can do the threat models themselves and everything gets threat modeled. So my goal is to make a bunch of mini security engineers throughout the organization. You want to make sure that you have an army of those folks. They can hit up every single feature, and they'll be good at finding all of the security problems within their systems, and they'll be empowered to fix those things as well. Imagine that you discovered a vulnerability. And as a developer, imagine if you discovered a vulnerability, you would want to make sure it gets fixed. You'll have that motivation to fix it. So you found it, you own it, the sort of situation. So does that mean it's a vacation time? Not just yet. So we should also talk about some of the things that self-serve threat modeling is not. So self-serve threat modeling doesn't mean that security is no longer involved in the threat modeling process. Again, we talked about it earlier. It just means that security is going to be now a part of, it allows security to focus their efforts on the most important risks within the organization. So you might decide that's your authentication or authorization services. It might be protecting PHI, what have you. You get to focus your efforts there. Self-serve threat modeling is also not a program where you can blame developers if they miss something. There's no use pointing fingers at anyone. If they miss a risk, that's okay. Security engineers miss risks all the time. This program is about team effort and finding ways to make the threat models stronger. Self-serve threat modeling also means that security folks are not out of a job. We all know that if one of our responsibilities are taken away, there'll be 100 to replace them. And this self-serve threat modeling does not substitute other important security programs that you have or tooling. So you should still have security scanning tools, SAST, IAST, whatever. You should still continue pen testing, bug bounties, having a robust metrics program. Yeah, self-serve threat modeling doesn't take away that. Okay, perfect. I'll keep an eye on chat. Newbie question, is it uncommon for developers to do threat modeling? Yes, it actually is quite uncommon. Developers will participate in the threat modeling sessions, but most companies that I've been a part of, most threat models that I've been part of, the security team is the one that is running the threat models and providing guidance on how to do threat modeling. Great question, Ro. So what are the actual benefits of it? So a few of the things that I assumed initially was developer was no longer going to be blocked on security. Every single feature will be threat modeled. And it was beyond that actually as part of our program. So what we noticed is that development, yes, is less likely to be blocked because they are doing a lot more of the threat modeling process. Every single feature is now getting a threat model, and more people are interested in threat modeling. I was shocked with how good the engineers were at threat modeling. It actually was quite scary how good it was, and I'll talk about a story with respect to that. And our security culture, it increased leaps and bounds as part of this. So there were hugs and a lot of love everywhere. So a lot more folks started reaching out to the security team, to me directly as part of it. A lot of the conversations with the engineers they were getting deeper with their thoughts about risks and security and how to improve the posture. And I was able to identify so many more security champions. So people, they reach out, they talk about interesting problems. So we don't have a formalized security champions program just yet, but now I have a long list of people that I know I can rely upon on the engineering side for security thoughts. And hopefully once we have a formalized security champions program, I know exactly who to reach out to. Yeah, how to get buy-in from dev management to support this? You are fantastic. Great question, because we're going to do a deep dive and we're going to figure out how to get exec and engineering buy-in. Perfect timing for that question. So in order to actually implement this program, you really have to sell security and why this is important. We talked about some of the benefits. So we talked about better security means that it's going to be fewer vulnerability, which means that it's going to be less engineering time to spend on fixing security problems, which will in itself increase developer velocity. By not waiting for the security team to review or threat model these changes, it also increased development velocity. So, and on top of it, there's minimal engineering time required. When we're looking at the big term picture, there's so little engineering time required for training that it makes sense. Doesn't make sense not to do it. And let me dive deeper into these items. So let's talk about training it itself. As part of Selfserve, we felt that there's going to be 4 phases as part of it. You can have training, observation, review, and security optional. So in my world, I feel that there's only 2 phases, training and then security optional. And the reason I think is that training phase is obviously training phase, but observational phase is really, you're doing training version 2. It's like having hands-on training. The review phase is another opportunity for training, especially if there are things that are missed. And then you get to security optional, which is security optional. There's, in my mind, it's the second phase to it. So when we're talking about training, there are a few things that we want to make note of it. So one is engineers actually have to know how to threat model. And because of that, we had some principles that we came up with as part of designing the training. So we want to enhance engineering's motivation to learn. I'm not too sure about you all, but if you're the same as me, I tend to learn a lot more when the material is fun and engaging. You want the engineers to really want to learn, and you want them to crave going to the future sessions. So make the sessions interactive, have a lot of questions for the group. Keep the group small enough that people are comfortable and not afraid to speak up or get involved. You also have to realize that security is a marathon and not a sprint. So there's no reason that all of the training has to be done in one go. When you think about self-serve threat modeling, it's not a small program. It's a multi-year investment. And when you have a multi-year program, you can build it out however you think is the right way. And I really want to make sure that we're building the training in a way that it is relevant to our business. So you have to do threat modeling in the same vein as you do threat modeling within an organization. So if you do risk assessments, train engineers to do risk assessments. If you do stride, train engineers to do stride. Just make sure that you incorporate threat modeling into the training into the right threat modeling workflow that you have. Again, the goal of training is to teach people how they can retain the most information and do threat modeling well. So with those principles in mind, we decided to spread the training over 3 sessions because I didn't want to have everyone sit in one day and get through everything. So every time I go to Black Hat or OWASP trainings, I feel that I don't retain enough information because all of that information is sort of sent to you within one sitting. So you get either 8 or 16 hours of training, and I probably only retain about 10% on a good day. So guess what? You have employees of a company. They're going to be there for more than just a weekend. So you can structure the training in any fashion that you think makes the most benefits. So the way that we split it up is we did 3 trainings over 6 weeks. And the actual ask for the engineering team was that we just need 5 hours for the training. It's going to be an hour and a half for the first training, an hour and a half for the second training, and 2 hours for the third training. So 5 hours over 6 weeks for security training, and we will have someone that's good enough to at least attempt to threat model. So when we're talking about getting buy-in from the exec and the engineering team, when you tell them that like the benefits, you're going to have faster velocity, we're going to find fewer security vulnerabilities, and in addition, we only need 5 hours of yours in 6 weeks. It was an easy sell at that point. And how did I split the training? First one, I split it up so that we would introduce the concept of threat modeling. What is threat modeling? And a lot of folks on the engineering side didn't really understand it. So just bringing that, just the introduction. And then we talked about STRIDE as well. How do security engineers discover vulnerabilities in the system? And I want to make sure that people got a little bit of hands-on practice with that. The second training, we introduced assets and data classifications, and we did a few more exercises, hands-on exercises, and got our hands a little bit dirtier. So for me personally, I learned a lot with the examples, so just doing that made things a little bit easier. And the third session was actual threat model that we did. And for the most part, the way that we structured the trainings, we did the individual teams. So we're able to do a deep dive of an application that they already own. So they were able to get their hands dirty with that. So this way, training folks, it was really easy for them to retain the information because it was spread out in a lot of sessions. And they really got, and we made sure that they did live examples. So they really got a lot out of this, out of these sessions. One thing that I've done is that Segment was great enough to open source the trainings. And I have a slide for you you can copy afterwards so you can see exactly what the training that we delivered. Yeah, great question. Do we stick to STRIDE or are there other frameworks that you follow to adapt it to the team? Yeah, for the most part, we at Segment, we follow STRIDE and find that was the easiest for us and easy for our teams to sort of discover. So that's what we ended up implementing. But I highly recommend you don't break away from what your organization is doing. Just make sure that you're teaching them in the same vein. Yeah, so second and third trainings, did you use a threat modeling training tool or was it over pen and paper? So the philosophy that we had there, that's a great question, Gagan. The philosophy that we had was that we want to make mini security engineers. And we felt in order to make mini security engineers, what we need to do is sort of teach the engineers how to threat model and teach them STRIDE and have them finely tune their sense of discovering vulnerabilities. And so that we went over architectural diagrams, a bunch of them, so that they can review and ask questions and try to discover those sort of vulnerabilities. And so it was pen and paper as much as we can through Zoom, but we definitely didn't use a threat modeling tool. Yeah, where did you find good examples? I'm new to threat modeling with STRIDE and with Microsoft Tool. I haven't found any good examples. Great question, Janice. I remember when I started my first threat models, I had no idea what I was doing. And it was because the internet doesn't have too many threat modeling examples. It is horrible. And it took me years to get good at it because I'd have to sit in with people that actually know what they're doing and better understand how they did it. And over a lot of practice, it took it, it, it took a lot of practice to get better. So for some of the threat models, for most of the threat models, actually, we made up examples. And actually, you can see them as part of the threat modeling training, the links after. So have a look at them. There's some examples there. And then, yeah, you can see if you can discover vulnerabilities. And if not, just reach out. I have contact information. We can share some of the things that we've discovered as part of it. Okay, a few questions. Can't this result in more developers jumping into security after a while, which is not bad overall, but can be a bad investment for organization? Great question. For me, that would be an even bigger security win. I would so love that. You're right. The organization might not like it, but I haven't seen it happen at all within Segment. But I don't feel it's a bad thing within an organization. And depending on the organizations, they may even encourage internal movement. So working at Segment Twilio acquired Segment late last year. They have actually a program internally that encourages internal movement because they rather retain employees. So having people switch over to security would be a good thing here at Segment Twilio. Any conflict of interest observed? Usually developers have strict timelines to follow. How did they manage overall? Yeah, that's a great question. There's definitely no conflict of interest as part of it. As part of the workflow, you have to get threat modeling done, our SDL, our Security Development Lifecycle, and there wasn't any conflict of interest. I'll talk a little bit more about which stage we are on at right now and why I feel that there's no conflict of interest just yet. Is self-serve threat modeling mandatory to all developers, or do you target? Oh, that's a great question, Vincent. It is actually mandatory for everyone within Segment. So I'll talk more about why it's a little bit easier at Segment than other organizations. But yeah, we want to make sure that everyone knows how to threat model. In my ideal world, I don't want to just reduce it to engineering. I also want to make sure that our data scientists, our IT support staff knows how to threat model as well, because it would be really important as part of their overall work that they do. Okay, so some of the training takeaways is that you got to remember, it takes years for us security professionals to get good at threat modeling. And it's going to take years for the engineers to get good at threat modeling as well. So you have to make sure that you bring the training to them. You have to make it easy for them. You have to, what we did is we moved from the physical concept. So we threat modeled personal safety and moved it over to threat modeling examples. And one particular is that we threat modeled a house. So how can an adversary break into a house? And what are the things that you want to protect? So doing that initially, we were able to just talk about the things that people really understand and translate that into the software world. So when we're talking about assets, in the housing example, the house is an asset, the people living inside is an asset, and then the things you have are assets. And then we related that back over to the software world, where the house itself, we related it back to infrastructure. That's how your systems are. So it could be S3 or things in AWS. And then the assets, the people and the things that you have are data flowing in and going out. So once we slowly talked about the physical, the concept I really understand, we translated it into software and then made the connection to that. So you have to make sure that you get to the development mindset. Have lots of hands-on practice. We have breakout sessions to have people give feedback to themselves over and over so that they really, really understand it. One lesson I learned, one big lesson that I learned was failing fast. So I'll probably repeat this a few times throughout this talk. The reason failing fast is important is that what I procrastinated. I want to deliver the perfect training to the engineers on the first attempt. And it took me longer than I hoped to actually get something ready. So having chatted with my boss, he mentioned fail fast, have beta teams, have people that are going to provide the feedback you need in order to do this well. And that worked fantastic. So we dogfooded it. I provided the very rough first version of the training to our security team. Got a lot of great feedback. I found 2 beta engineering teams to try it against. Got even more great feedback. And I felt that after those 3 iterations, I was 98% of the way there. So great thing to fail fast. And so this program, I started thinking about this program February 2020. And in my mind, I was like, okay, I'll probably have to travel to San Francisco, deliver the training in person. I can train the people in Vancouver, no problem. And then COVID happened. And then I had to figure out how to deliver a workshop online. And I had never done that before. So um, it's definitely challenging to train folks over Zoom. So there's a few things that you can do. So make sure that people leave a video on so that you can see that they're engaged. I love asking random questions to people so that I keep them on their toes and they pay more attention. There are a lot of different things that you can do to make sure that you're keeping your audience engaged. Okay. And then if you have really strong training, you're going to get people that are super excited about training itself. So the training that we have was super engaging. We made sure that there are a lot of different questions, and we made sure that there's a lot of time. We built in extra time so that people can interrupt and ask questions. So nothing can really replace good training. So from the training phase in your self-serve threat modeling program, you move over to, once the training is done, you move to the observation phase. And as I sort of mentioned, it's really training version 2. You move from the theory to becoming an intern or having a hands-on apprenticeship. That's all you think about it that way. So you want to make sure as part of this process that the engineering team is actually doing the heavy lifting. Have the appropriate DRI, focus on getting all the appropriate documentation, prepare for the threat modeling. They should be leading the threat modeling sessions themselves. And technically, this shouldn't take too much more effort. So again, when we're selling the threat modeling to the execs, we talked about the 5 hours of training. And for every threat model, it's really half an hour more of the DRI, the directly responsible individual, their time to organize all the threat modeling material, and about a half an hour for everyone that's doing the threat model. So very, very minimal additional ask as part of it. And it shouldn't take too much more effort. We talked about additional half an hour because the DRI has to put it in effort to do the documentation. And as part of the threat modeling process, the self-serve, like security's as part of the observation phase, security's still in the room, but it's engineering that's doing the threat modeling. And as a security person, you don't want to tell engineers what the vulnerabilities are, but you want to give them hints and coach them. And you want to make sure that they know how to properly prioritize vulnerabilities and which ones that they should remediate. So the engineer leaving every threat model should feel that they've learned something new, they've accomplished something. And the goal is to make sure that they're starting to discover all the critical and high priority vulnerabilities. And then you know that they're ready to move on to that next stage. So it's only an additional half an hour to get all of the threat modeling documentation ready, and another half an hour because you want to make sure that you're teaching them to discover vulnerabilities and teaching them how to prioritize and which ones to remediate. Yeah, do you have self-serve mapped to ASVS? How do you handle the classification and record all the risks? Okay, great question, Dean. At Segment, we don't map it back to ASVS. we do our own, we want to make sure that devs are able to prioritize their vulnerabilities how they seem it's appropriate, and we just coach them to it. One of the things I like showing is CWSS, a common weakness scoring system, and showing them how they can, as scientifically as possible, they can sort of score it that way. And how do we record the risks? As part of this threat modeling process, the observation phase, security is still in the room. And what we do is we have a security operation ticket within Jira. And we have a design review ticket. And then we put all of the operational tickets underneath it. And it's just like a regular vulnerability ticket in our world. So even though the system might not have been made, it is already a vulnerability in their system, and it has appropriate SLAs as per when they'll deliver the project, plus a little bit extra time to make sure that they have to, if the things go over. So you want to make sure that they have the ability to actually fix these things. Perfect. Okay. So observation takeaways. I sort of mentioned sell initially. I feel as a security engineer, we need to always sell and take this opportunity to work with the engineers to put together the documentation required for the threat modeling. So one of the best advice that I've gotten in my career is the best way to scale your security program is to talk to people one-on-one. That might sound counterintuitive, but it's worked out wonders in my career. So talking to individuals one-on-one usually means that I can get them really interested in security and why security is important, which will help ensure that they think about security as part of their day jobs. So when you're preparing those documents together, you have that one-on-one time. You can sort of sell them more about self-serve threat modeling or just security in general. Threat modeling is a team sport. So make sure you have enough people in the conversation and there are enough diverse opinions there too. And as part of the threat modeling process, make sure that you're DMing people that are not talking a lot. I noticed one of my coworkers is here. I've either called him out directly or I have DM'd him to make sure that he voices his opinion. And it's great. Every time he mentions one of his concerns, it's something new to me and things that I didn't even consider. So it's really, really important that that everyone gets involved. And you can't let people be quiet. They have to converse about what their concerns are. And close the loop. Make sure that you hit people up and let them know if they did a great job. They did a great job. If there's some gaps, let them know that as well. Yeah, so what I've observed as part of it, literally the very first self-serve threat model that I did it with another coworker of mine, and I was blown away how well the engineer prepared the documentation. We got to the room, we discussed threats, and me and my coworker literally added zero value to that threat modeling session. They had discovered everything that we considered, and it made me super proud of them. Like I felt great that they were good at it, but I felt pretty bad that I thought I'll be relevant for a lot longer. But yeah, I like being an engineer because I like feeling replaceable. So again, close the loop, make sure that you reach out to the engineers afterwards and let them know that they did a great job. And this is what we did in this one particular threat model. I had a conflict during that particular session. I was only available for the first half an hour, and he did a fantastic job. And I felt that I can actually leave the threat model without feeling that I missed anything. So they did fantastic. They started calling out people, getting people involved, and they discovered a ton of vulnerabilities. Okay, so I want to say that we're mostly in the observation phase. And even at Segment, we're aiming to get to this review phase where we're no longer in the threat modeling meetings themselves. engineers are creating the documentation, they're discovering the threats in the system, they're prioritizing it, and then marking the ones that they want to remediate. So all of our job is to sort of review the artifacts out of that particular meeting. And in reality, we've actually ran into a few of these situations at Segment. There have been a few situations where the engineer didn't really understand the process. And what they did is, as part of creating the documentation for the threat modeling session, they actually did the threat model on their own. And it was fantastic. When we actually got to the threat modeling session, everything was there. They did a fantastic job. I think they caught like 90% of the vulnerabilities, and many of the things I didn't even consider as well. So it was very, very fantastic. So at this point, we want to make sure that engineers are able to really understand how to prioritize and which vulnerabilities that they should remediate. Our job is to make sure that they're doing it. And hopefully at this point, that with the group of people that are threat modeling, all of the critical, high, and medium vulnerabilities are discovered as part of this process. And then we have security optional, the utopia. So everything should be threat modeled. What I mean to say by that is it doesn't matter what your skill is, 100 or 10,000 engineers, you are now able to threat model every feature that goes out. Security doesn't need to be in there. It's security optional. And security should only be involved in things that interest them or in the most sensitive of areas of your system. And everything else should be optional. And at this phase, we should hopefully start seeing a drop of vulnerabilities discovered by third parties. Things should be happening pretty well. All the high, critical, and medium vulnerabilities should be discovered by the threat modeling process. And hopefully you have to bump up your bug bounty rewards so that more people join the program because it's harder to find vulnerabilities. And this is what we all dream about. Security is truly optional in this phase. And we want to make sure that we just focus on, as we talked, the initial goals is only focusing on the most riskiest of areas, be it threat modeling or other programs. So now you can actually kick your feet up for reals. Yeah, great question. What kind of artifacts are delivered at the end of a self-serve threat model? Do you ask engineers to maintain security diagrams? Yeah, that's a great question, Vincent. So what we have is we have a SDD, sorry, now I'm thinking too much security, a software design document. And as part of the software design document, we have a security section within there. And one part of the security section is actually threat model. So as part of these templates, it is already expected that the engineering teams deliver threat modeling artifacts. So that should be part of their document. And we have a few things that we require. We want to know what the architectural diagram looks like, what are the assets, what's in scope, what's not out of scope as part of this threat model. We want to know the risks, how you prioritize it. And then from there, we can take it on, make sure that if we want to generate more tickets or not. Yeah, were legacy systems in scope? We're going to talk about that in retrospective. That's a great question. So before we get to some of the challenges, we'll talk about some wins. So I'm about a year and a bit into this experiment. What have I learned? And I talked about a few of these already, but we're threat modeling more often. I feel that we're threat modeling a lot more often and than we've done in the past. So I feel the concept of threat modeling is in reach with all of the engineers at Segment. They better understand what needs to be done and what their role is within the threat model itself. The knowledge gap that played a big part of it before is no longer there. So they're not really afraid of it. Engineers are threat modeling better than us. I sort of mentioned that before. And I think the reason that they're better than us, there's a lot of reasons why they're better than us. One of the big reasons is they know their systems way better than we do. I, as a security engineer, I have to come in, I have maybe a few hours to learn their system and then ask security questions, I can only go an inch deep. Whereas they built their systems. They've probably spent years building their systems. They know their systems inside and out. So when we threat model, if they know how to do threat modeling, they're going to be much, much, much better at it than I would. I cannot discover these vulnerabilities as they would. One of the things that I feel is that, engineers don't have to be perfect at threat modeling. As long as there's enough eyes within the room, if there's enough people there, they'll spot all the big things. So the critical high vulnerabilities, that's the goal for us. We want to really make sure that we're taking care of those sort of things. We talked a little bit about security cultural improvements. And again, people are reaching out more to us. And I feel that it's probably because, like, I don't know if it's that they're more interested because they understand security more, or now that they're exposed to what security is really like and it's more interesting to them, but it doesn't really matter. Like, there are more folks that really want to help us out, the security team, which makes our work a lot easier. And I keep harping on failing fast. That's one of the wins for us for sure. Like, being able to learn that it's okay to have beta teams, test it out. Don't have analysis paralysis, just keep moving faster and forward, just try it out. So yeah, I think you mentioned incentivizing bug bounties in the end. Oh, sorry. So what I mentioned is that, I think Vincent definitely answered that, is that because it's harder to find vulnerabilities in your system because everything is now being threat modeled, that bug bounty researchers probably don't want to join your program unless it's really worth their time. So it might be maybe 5x your initial rates or 10x. So you really want to incentivize them to dig deeper and find vulnerabilities. Yeah, sorry for the miscommunication there. Okay, self-serve challenges. So the biggest one, let's talk about the elephant in the room. It's a multi-year program. So it's really rare that people stay on for multi-years, for more than 2 years. So you need to make sure whoever is running your program is there for a few years, or there are a lot of folks that can actually move that program forward. So multi-year means it's a large and a key investment from the security team. You need to make sure that there's focus and people are driving towards the right results. And you have to make sure that there's continuity, even if someone were to leave the organization. So, and like, the investment makes a lot of sense on the engineering and the security side, but it is a very difficult program to manage by an individual. And it requires a lot of folks to drive this program forward. Training is hard for a lot of reasons. So one of which is, have you ever tried delivering training on someone else's presentation? I built out the training, I know it inside and out, but having my coworkers deliver it, it's really difficult. They understand the content, but it's not theirs. They don't really own it. So it's just hard. You want to make sure that you give them enough autonomy so that they are able to modify it and make it a bit of their own. So that's one thing that you got to realize with it. And training is hard because you have to train a bunch of trainers, and training trainers is also difficult. You can think of a particular problem in one way, and they think about it another way. So again, give them the space that they need to sort of make the training their own. You're still going to have regular threat modeling challenges. So someone mentioned legacy systems in scope. That's a regular threat modeling challenge. Threat models go stale. That's still going to be still a problem as part of self-serve threat modeling. So how do you organize all your threat models? What do you do when they go stale? How do you prompt people to re-threat model certain areas? Again, these problems don't go away with self-serve threat modeling, and you still need to be vigilant to make sure that you're on top of your threat modeling program. And this is something that I noticed as part of this, and I have work scheduled later this year to sort of address our threat model program in itself. And make sure that it is always healthy and vibrant. Okay, so what are some other problems? I feel segment is easy. We only have 125 to 150 engineers. So I personally, myself, I trained about 80% of the engineers by myself. But how do you scale this program to a company that has several thousand developers? I feel that one of the major success as a part of this program is that we had live personal training. And if you made someone watch a video, it's just not going to be the same. So there are definitely scaling problems to this that I haven't uncovered yet. We're in the process of integrating with Twilio. And if we decide to scale it out to their program or to their company, to our company, larger company, that's a couple thousand people that I have to train. So if I figure out this solution to this problem, I'll definitely let you all know. Last thing is that it's really hard to maintain a good ratio of trained folks. People leave the company all the time and new people join. So you have to make sure that you have continuously available training, making sure that you have a strong ratio. You don't want to have a situation where barely anyone as part of the threat modeling process doesn't know how to threat model. So these are some of the bigger challenges with this program. There are lots and lots of challenges. And again, you really need someone, a few someones to have a lot of focus and determination to roll something like this out. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about next steps. So for me, I'm really working hard to make sure that we push all of the teams into this review stage. Some teams are getting there, and I don't want security to be as part of the threat modeling meetings. I want us to review the artifacts as part of it. And I want to make sure that we're promoting the teams correctly. And I rather err on the side of caution and not promote them than promote them too early and then have to sort of demote them. So it's a tricky balance there. I'm working really hard to train the trainers. Before I was running all 3 trainings, now I run training 1. I have another coworker that runs training 2, and a different coworker that runs training number 3. So I've reduced the amount of trainings that I do, but I still need more folks to be able to do all the training. So I need to make sure that there are a lot of folks available to do it. And I talked a little bit about it's really easy on segment scale, but it's going to be challenging on Twilio's. As we're sort of integrating and talking about integration between amongst our teams, I really want to think about how do I scale this. A couple thousand developers or a few thousand, I'm not even sure how many developers there are on Twilio, but there's no way that I'm going to train 80% of all the Twilio developers. I don't think I have enough time in my day to do that. So I'll have to think of a better way of actually of doing that. The last thing I want to do is I sort of want to keep letting you know what's going on with our program. We're really happy with our program and we want to share the results. So I'll continuously send out blogs and update my talks and let you know all the new things that are happening. Yeah, what's the trigger to start a threat model? Is threat model including in the definition of done of a feature? Great question, Vincent. So as part of our SDD, our software design document, we have a checklist of security questions that we ask the development team. And we also ask them to create a SecOps ticket, a security operational ticket. And then we'll have a quick look at the actual SDD as well as what they've answered as part of the security question checklist. And then from there, we'll make a decision if a particular area has to be threat modeled. But the goal is to sort of like what you said, a definition of done for a feature so it should be a regular part. It should be an NFR, non-functional requirement to actually get the threat model done with the goal that we threat model all new things that we build out. Okay, I like assigning other people tasks. So if this actually seems interesting for you, read the blog post. I have some information there, go into depth about each individual training, review the trainings. We've open sourced them. And then sort of better understand how your organization is set up and modify the training to suit your needs. And feel free to hit me up. Like the whole purpose of us to talk about this program and open source our training is that other people learn how to do it, and we all get better as a community. You all are smart, and I know that you'll learn things that I didn't even uncover or discover, and I'm hoping that you'll share that back with me and all of our programs get better. So a few key takeaways from this presentation. Self-serve is a multi-year program, but it doesn't require too much extra effort on the engineering side. Just a little bit of training and a little extra for each threat model. So you should be able to sell this program internally. A lot of the actual security training is compressed, like the ones that you go to Black Hat, at DEF CON, all that sort of stuff. And it's a fire hose for the users. You don't need to do that with your program. You have the long game. Those individuals are there for a few years at your company. So think about how best to educate your engineering team so that they can understand how to threat model. And don't burn yourself out with the trainings. So if it's a one-person shop, doing these trainings over and over and over and over again, it might get kind of boring. So make sure that you're not the only one that's running them. Just distribute that load well in your team. How are the developers calculating the risks? Any tailored or standard risk framework followed across all products? Yeah, we don't have anything like that. Right now, we're just asking them to sort of prioritize the risks that they see. And I talked a little bit about how security does a risk, or how we prioritize a vulnerability within segment. We use CWSS, Common Weakness Scoring System, which I find is fascinating. It's the smaller sibling of CVSS, but I highly recommend you hear and learn up about that. Okay, resources. Oh, but before I get there, Twilio and Segment are hiring. So we have a great ratio of security engineers to engineering, which means we get to focus our efforts strategically, and we're not always stuck in operational work. So if self-serve threat modeling seems like a great strategic project to you, then, and we feel it's a great program and it helps ensure that we have a strong security posture for the future. So if this interests you, feel free to review our careers page for Segment and Twilio and reach out if you have any questions. I don't know if it's a pro or a con, but you get to work with me. I'm hoping that's a pro for some of you folks there. Okay, right. So actual resources. So feel free to snapshot this page. We have the blog up there. We have our open source training, SSTM, self-serve threat modeling at segment.com. That will send a note to me. So feel free to ask me questions about it. Okay, thank you. Yeah, if you have any questions, it's a good time to ask questions. You can follow me at ask Jeevan Singh. All right, we will start this new one. Small intro. I work with, I've known David for a few years. I got an opportunity to work with him for about a little over a year at Segment. It was fantastic. I really enjoyed working with him, picking his mind on a lot of the systems that were built within Segment, the ones that he actually built as well. And so very much looking forward to modern SAST automation with you. So I'll let you take it away, David.
Right on. So, yep, this is modern SAST automation. I am David. And I probably could have also called this talk security linting. My goal here is not to do a deep dive into any like very technical static analysis topics, but more to, I think, talk about and share what a lot of the modern approaches that organizations are taking with their static analysis systems, how their tooling works, and kind of like the approaches, with their approaches, kind of like modern versus traditional. So, rough idea of what we're going to be going over. I'm going to compare like what I think traditional like SAST setups configurations are versus what like the modern approaches are. I'll touch on security culture because you really can't do anything in security without a good security culture. Cover some of the properties of modern static analysis, and then we'll actually walk through what it looks like to set it up yourself. Like what are all those steps? And then finally, I'll review 3 different kind of examples of how it's being used in practice by people way smarter than myself. So it's some really cool examples of kind of like what I'm talking about in practice, which I think is always more interesting to see versus like just kind of talking about it. So about me, I've been a contributor to the open source project Zap, where I built the heads up display feature. So I spent a while doing that, and I spent almost 3 years as a security engineer at Segment, where, as you've mentioned, I had the pleasure of working with him. And while I was working there, I was working to secure like herds of Node and Golang microservices, all kind of running in AWS. And since leaving Segment, I have now joined Boost Security, where we are working to build a security automation as code platform. I'm not going to be talking about Boost, and kind of like not the topic of this talk, but if you like are interested or kind of like the things I'm talking about, definitely reach out to me afterwards. I'm happy to tell you like what we're working on. Some disclaimers. I am not a static analysis expert. So if you have some very deep technical questions, I'm not the person to ask. I'm just kind of sharing what it looks like to use these things in practice. Some words. So SAST and static analysis, I'm going to use those interchangeably. For anyone who doesn't know, SAST is just an acronym that means static analysis security tooling. It's the same thing. And when I refer to security linting, it's kind of the same thing as just thinking about like lightweight static analysis. So you can kind of look at like a feature set of like what does traditional static analysis have? There's taint analysis and all this these other things. And security linting is going to be, if you look at the feature set, it has a little bit less of it. There's some trade-offs there, which we'll talk about a little bit later. That's what I'm going to mean when I talk about a security linter. And finally, some assumptions. So we're going to assume that static analysis is good. Static analysis is not perfect. Static analysis often isn't great, but I'm not going to spend time convincing you that like static analysis tools are something you should use. We're going to assume that's another tool in our security tool belt that we can use as a part of like integrating with the pipeline and things we can use to make organizations more secure. And we're also going to assume that low severity vulns aren't your highest priority. So I don't know anyone whose list of backlog of vulnerabilities is all lows. If you are that person, please talk to me afterwards. I'd love to ask you a lot of questions. But the assumption here is that we're all like a typical security team has a lot of risks they're trying to solve, and they're feeling typically overwhelmed. And so because of that, there may be some decisions we want to make about how we approach static analysis. Cool. So let's first talk about what a traditional SAST workflow looks like. So traditionally, static analysis tools run very long. They're pretty heavyweight. You're trying to find a lot of findings. And because of this, a common setup would be to have your SAST tool run on a cron job, right? So maybe you run your static analysis tool once a week. And it's going to report some findings. And I've been a part of product demos where large SaaS vendors are like, they whip open their Zoom. They're like, yeah, here's what we got. And so, yeah, you can see we've started running it on your repository. So I'll check in tomorrow and we'll see what the results are. And it's like, that's crazy. So that's what we kind of assume with that. So let's kind of walk through it hypothetically here. Let's say we've got our traditional static analysis tool, cron is running, let's say every like Sunday night. Let's say it's Monday and we have a developer and they commit a vulnerability to the source code. Happens, right? Happens to the best of us. So let's say they committed it on Monday and then 1 week rolls by and now your static analysis tool is going to run. Static analysis gonna look at your source code. It's gonna try to find some vulnerabilities. It's gonna spit out some findings. And let's say in this hypothetical, your security team, part of like their on-call rotation is that like on Wednesdays to go review these findings. So several days later, your security person is now going to triage these vulnerabilities, these findings. I think it's pretty safe to assume that if we're looking at two stick figures and one's a developer and one's security, and you have to pick the one with the top hat, the monocle, the mustache, the security developer, I think it's pretty safe to say the security person is more likely to be the one with that kind of setup. So you can see here that the security person is now going to take the findings and they have to triage, right? They need to make decisions on whether a vulnerability, reviewing the severity, is it worth trying to solve right now? They're going to kind of review some like the other metrics that come through, like the confidence levels. They're going to try to validate the vulnerability, this finding that was returned. And they're going to then take that, they're going to write it up into a ticket, and they're going to add a bunch of helpful descriptions. They're going to convert this SAST speak into something a developer can understand. And they're going to toss it over the metaphorical wall and assign it to a developer. Of course, the developer can't just start working on it, right? They're still in the middle of their sprint work. So maybe 2 weeks later go by, they're still finishing their sprint. And finally, the ticket gets assigned to them and they just immediately commit the fix, first try, it's in. So with traditional static analysis, I mean, it's pretty clear to see we have a long window from discovering a finding to getting the fix in. And in this setup, the developer is also out of context when they're trying to fix it. What I mean by that is when they first committed this vulnerability, it's like 3 weeks since, there's a 3 week span since they've like committed to when they're gonna start fixing it. They've already kind of forgot all the little pieces they were at. You know what I mean? Like I think there's like an XKCD comic, right? Of like all the little steps you build just to get to the point where you know how to like start fixing a problem. And as soon as you lose focus, it all goes away. And then there's, you can see here, this requires security to triage this. So let's now compare that to what modern static analysis workflows look like. So because it is 2021, we have continuous integration, continuous deployment. And now when our developers committing a vulnerability to source code, all their nice developer tools start kicking off the CI and their CI/CD pipeline. They've got linters in there, they've got their builds, they got test suites running, but we're gonna sneak a security linter in there. We're gonna put it right in the middle of their pipeline there. And the security linter is gonna be built to run much quicker than a traditional SAST tool. And so just mere moments later, from when they've committed this vulnerability, the security linter is gonna have findings, add comments right on the PR, and within moments of committing the vulnerability, the developer now has the ability to fix it. Just an immediate fix. The developer's still in that context. They're still kind of in the mind space that they need to be to address kind of like where this issue arose in their code. And security was not required. So boom, problem solved. Well, obviously not quite, right? There was a lot of hand waving and a lot of magic going on there, right? There's probably some questions to ask. Okay, you just said security linters are faster. How? Why, right? Like, what's the catch? You don't get that for free. Like, how are you integrating these tools? Where are they running? Like, who's building these things? Like, who's maintaining this? And I think for some folks, less of a question, probably more of an exclamation is, how can you remove that security expert? Like, we're special, we're security, right? Like, we have all the know-how, we know all the context. Like, we're the one who can take these things and add our value to them. And so I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but just to kind of tease it a little bit is the way we're gonna make this work is that we're gonna make some trade-offs. And so simpler checks are gonna allow you to run faster. We're gonna focus on high signal, low false positive rules. And we're gonna make sure that the feedback we get from these tools is actionable and clear. I'm also making a note that security isn't that special. Security is important. Security requires a lot of time and like effort to develop, but security is just another skill. And I think that security teams, when they're working at their best, can help impart some of their security magic onto developers, onto the rest of the organization. And so just acknowledging that, trying to find ways that you can transfer your skills and like in which ways you can most optimally do that is an important part. So now I'm going to touch on security culture. So there's a ton of talks already about security culture. I'm not going to belabor the point too much, but I want to address a few things I think can relate to static analysis and just add my 2 cents on a few of them. So if you want to build some static analysis, you need engineering buy-in, right? You're going to take your tool, you're going to put it in the development pipeline. You want it to go well, and you want them to be into it. There's a couple ways to foster engineering buy-in, top down and bottom up, right? You need the leadership to be gung-ho about getting security involved. But also, I think the bottom up is often discounted too much. Making friends with engineers, working closely with other developers, like having those relationships built will, I think, give you a much better chance of those developers, engineers wanting to engage with you and want to pilot your programs, want to try your new tools, not get super upset when your thing inevitably maybe breaks or has an error at some point, and they'll want to work with you to make it work. 2 other things I'll call out that I think Segment did a really good job with are security metrics and security embeds. So having security metrics from the security team feeding back to the engineering org is super important to getting engineering buy-in. You need to give them something to measure, you need to get something to work towards, and having the metrics makes it a much more like tangible measure of security. In security embeds, my old coworker Leaf wrote up a great blog post about how they did this at Segment. It's another like big part of relationship building. So taking your security team member and putting them on an engineering team for a sprint, a quarter, to build a feature. There's the value that the development team will get by having a security person there and working with them, hopefully, building some nice security features into whatever product or system they're working on. But even the flip side is arguably more important. Having your security team become empathetic towards developers, understanding what their build pipelines look like understanding how developers like workflow operates, like critical if you want to integrate your own tools into it. And I think too often we can easily like not want to get in the way and then try to poke in and then it kind of breaks. So just like embedding, like getting dirty and like getting involved with some of those projects. Security teams are going to be enablers versus blockers. Again, I think this is a pretty worn out. I think this has been repeated over and over again, but it's still worth just mentioning. I think one pragmatic step you can take towards that is with secure libraries. This is like one step you can do to go from security being often the team that's bringing up problems, like not offering solutions. So bringing secure libraries is another great way to build a strong security culture with your development teams. And finally, building your dev-centric workflows for all your security processes. So vulnerabilities are just bugs, in my opinion. Trying to make vulnerabilities more special is already pulling yourself away from what developers are naturally going to do. Like ultimately, at the end of the day, if you're working at a SaaS company, developers are building the product to get the revenue. That's like paying your salary. So security is definitely that support role, a very important one, but they are still the support role. And a couple other very tangible things to kind of build dev-centric workflows is empowering your product or project managers to handle risk themselves. There's another really cool project that my old manager, Eric, LI Segment worked at, where part of the security or the vulnerability management process was taking tickets, explaining the risk, and then putting it in a way that related to business outcomes so that when you handed it off to a PM, they would decide how to prioritize that ticket. And when you're building security tools, you're gonna need to integrate it with dev tooling. One thing at Boost, like one kind of philosophical point we have is that we don't believe that developers, you have to go log into some portal to use security tooling. Like they already have enough tools as is. So let's integrate with where they're at, whether that's GitHub, whether it's Jira, or it's Slack, whatever it may be. Kind of cultural adjacent is mindset. So you want to aggressively prioritize risk. And this is, whether it's every day, whether it's every week, sprint, quarter, like you should have a list of your highest risks to the business, security risks, and you should be making sure your efforts are focused on the right things. So when you do go to tackle these problems, definitely start by solving vulnerability classes, right? Not one-off security bugs. And security default and paved roads, I think phrases kind of thrown around a lot, but two very important concepts that the folks at Netflix have always done like a really good job talking about. So if any talks by Asta from Netflix or any other team there are really good. And how these kind of map to, we're looking at static analysis. When you're aggressively prioritizing risk, you need to ask, are low severity vulnerabilities the highest priority? I think it's really easy to kind of get down the rabbit hole on picking rule sets when you're setting up static analysis. And why start reporting, focusing, sharing with developers these low severity vulnerabilities if it's just gonna be time wasted, not focused on the right priority? You're looking at vulnerability classes. Are you picking out rules that are there to find like these one-off bugs, or are you picking rules that are there to solve entire classes of vulnerabilities? And finally, the rule sets you pick should be enforcing safe defaults, and your team should be providing secure libraries. Nice. All right, so let's talk about security tools and developers. So security tools are not built for developers, right? Security tools have been built for security experts. And because of that, they're built in a certain way that will not make them that friendly for developers to use as is. And a part of, I think, the modern approach to static analysis is trying to remove security from the equation as much as possible. And how do we quickly close that loop from results from a static analysis tool right to developers? And so as we go through that process, we need to keep in mind that the tools weren't necessarily built for that purpose. So security tools were often built to minimize false negatives. Put in another way, right? It means that they're trying to report every finding that they can that might be an issue. This is good when a security professional is using these security tools. They're able to get all this information and they can decide what's important, what's not. But as we start building these into our pipelines to send to developers, we need to be careful because we might be sending things that just aren't relevant and are wasting their time. And one thing, really good example of this is a pattern I see frequently in security linters and static analysis tools is this idea of an untrusted variable with being sent to a dangerous function. And so a common one might be like, okay, there's a variable being passed to, maybe something like eval, might be something like, maybe some other dangerous function thinking about. And some of those dangerous functions might just be like a no-go for you anyway. There's safer alternatives. You never need to be using, this eval. But in a lot of cases, it's just reporting a lot of like, this might be dangerous. And you're like, okay, well, let's be sure it's dangerous. And so some static analysis tools or security linters will have a feature called constant propagation. And so depending on how complex these tools are, whether they're parsing an AST, whether they go intra-function, intra-file, you may have the ability to say, okay, I know there's a variable going into this function, but we're able to follow it up this, the AST, and there's at the top, it's just a constant, so it's okay. Security tools also going to have a lot of low severity rules as kind of running out of the box. And again, that's fine. They want to provide you with the options, but it's something to keep in mind before you just turn on a security linter and start blasting at your development team. So a great example of this is from the tool TFSec, which is a Terraform security tool. And it's a great tool. And it has a rule that is, we'll be looking for a missing description in a security group resource. Now, like most people I know, that's not the biggest priority they need to solve. And so I wouldn't recommend turning that rule on and alerting your developers on it. And finally, the documentation just often isn't developer friendly. Some tools are better than others, but you kind of need to keep that in mind before you just, again, turn the fire hose on and start sending it that way. So on the flip side, what we can do, we want to make sure that you're tuning the rule set to minimize false positives. I love how simple it says it, right? Just turn off the false positives. It's that easy. I think one of my least favorite security vendor phrases, there's a lot of them. My least favorite one is 0 false positives. And you get an email from someone and they're going to tell you why there's 0 false positives. There's no such thing as 0 false positives. There's just no such thing. And so there's trade-offs that you can do to minimize instead. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. You also want to understand how these rules are going to apply to your code base. Everyone's code base is unique. Everyone's code base has its different tricks that certain rules just might not have anticipated, might not expect. You might find that some rule sets return too many false positives, even though you like what some of the results are. You might find that some rules work really well for what you have. So understanding what tools you're using applied to what your code base is going to be important to being successful with that. And finally, you just may need to add your own documentation. Either an internal wiki, maybe something more complex that maps unique descriptions to each rule, but making sure you get that right is going to be important for a good developer experience. When we're thinking about modern, I think, static analysis approaches, our goal is not to report every finding. When we integrate these things with our developer pipelines, we do not want to report all the issues to them. Our goal is to generate more fixes. The goal is to take what are our highest priority, our highest risk, the things that we can alert on that are the biggest gain, and like what can we do to convert these findings into the most security fixes we can get. And so here are some of these trade-offs that that come into play when you're trying to optimize static analysis tools for developer fixes. And I think if anyone ever watches like the 3-point contest in the NBA, there's that one money ball. I feel like this is my one money slide. I feel like this is a very concise explanation of kind of what I'm going for here. So we're going to prioritize low false positives over catching all possible issues. So if there's rules that are, that might be an issue, we don't want those. What the rules are like, yeah, if this is a pretty high confidence rule, we know that if this is found, like this is an issue. So that way, when these things then presented right to developer, we can be confident that it's something that's worth their time and it's not going to be a distraction. It's not going to be a false positive. That's a trade-off. We're going to be okay knowing that, well, some issues might get through, but the ones that we need to focus on, those are the ones we want to prioritize. And secondly, we're going to focus on high impact versus catching every small issue. So this is the severity scale. We just want to alert on things that are going to be the most impactful and not report on every small little issue. And finally, when you're returning these findings back to developers, they have to be actionable. They can be part of documentation or might just be the rule itself. If you're catching these ambiguous, complex issues where the solution is you return the finding to the developer and it's like, great, you have this permission error, go build a new permissioning system. It's like, all right, like that doesn't make any sense. So let's make sure that things we return have a clear action item on what developer can do to improve that specific finding. So high signal, high impact, and actionable rules are the ones that are going to get fixed. And those are the rule sets that we want. And the trade-offs. We're not getting this all for free. We're going to allow most of the stuff, that's all the noise, we're going to let that go by the wayside because it's just not the biggest priority. As you're going through this, I mean, the process matters in how you decide to roll out your static analysis. And so there's really 2 steps you want to do when you approach this. The first one is to first stop the bleeding. So instead of trying to worry about this huge backlog of issues that you may have, start first by implementing these tools in the build pipeline that are going to start alerting on new issues and start blocking. So stop all new issues from being created for a vulnerability class. And then once you've got that under control and there's no new problems being solved, then you can go back and start looking at your large backlog. Okay, let's find vulnerability classes in here. Let's find chunks of issues that we can go invest time in to removing. I often think there's gonna be a much better return on investment if you spend a quarter trying to, or a couple sprints trying to solve one big problem that solves multiple ones, and solving one-off vulnerabilities one at a time. Cool. So let's go through a walkthrough real quick, just what it would look like to actually build and set up kind of a static analysis pipeline. So here's a normal setup. We have our developer committing code to GitHub, and there's going to be some sort of CI tool running that's running all their nice developer tools, their linters, their builds, and their test suites. And here again, we're going to sneak in our security linter, right? That's where we want to build in this tool into the process. And at this stage, if you're kind of looking at maturity of your static analysis program, you can get really far with having one security linter running in your CI system on one repo. You might have them on a repo, and having that one linter set up is able to keep everything in check. And so here's a resource you can go to see a list of static analysis tools. Don't worry about trying to write that down. I'll publish my slides after this, and I'll have a list of all the resources. For the sake of argument, let's say in this example, we want to add a security linter. Let's say we've got a Rails code base, and so we're going to add the tool Brakeman, right? In this case, we are just running this tool in CI, and it's a build step. So if there are issues, it's going to fail the build step, or you can start with alert first and then work up to break. But that's going to be in this first step, that's what the developer sees. They're going to see this light, see the green or red for that build step. And they have to then go in to the CI system to see what are the results, right? What issues did I find? And if you're rolling this out for the first time, you can use the built-in suppression systems of static analysis tools, like the ignore files, to do this initial onboarding. So this hypothetical, we got this Rails database or Rails code base. They run Brakeman. Let's say there's 50 findings or something like that. You might start by putting in your Brakeman ignore file all of those findings right out of the gate. Like, don't worry about the backlog yet, but now you've got it on and you've got it in alert mode. You can start alerting developers on all new things that might be coming in. And you can get a lot of runway of just going this simple. Like, it might be this simple, and this might be what your organization needs to get started. And as a second step, you might want to, instead of requiring developers to go into the CI system to see what was the cause of the failure, maybe you actually want to have the system reach back in to the developer's workflow and put a comment in the PR. There's a lot of different ways you can go about this, but there's a lot of, you can do through GitHub Actions if that's part of your CI process. There's different GitHub apps that will coordinate this for you. A lot of different vendors. They can run these static analysis tools and immediately just put the feedback right in the pull request. So this is like, step 2, right? Now we've got a better experience where the developer is spending less time, results are being brought more directly in front of them. And again, that alone might get you a lot of carry. But often, if you've got a lot of GitHub repositories, you're kind of not going to run into a scaling problem. So if you're building this out on multiple, maybe multiple pipelines, maybe you've got your CI workflows defined as a file in each repository, and you want to go ahead and update all of those, depending where you work. Maybe you've got a couple dozen repos, maybe you've got over 1,000 repos, and that's just not going to work to do all this stuff by hand. And so now you're going to start, write a script that's going to go ahead and try to do a lot of this automation for you. Probably still quite a bit of manual work in there and getting those all approved potentially if you've got approval pathways. But this next step is like, how do we deal with this scale problem? Okay, now let's say you've got it all out there, right? Let's say you've got all of your build pipelines across hundreds of repos. They're all running the security linter tool. Well, each repo is going to have different context in it, right? There's going to be different importance. Maybe you've got a classification of repositories that are the important ones, the critical repos, and the other ones are support. Maybe some aren't that important. So because of that, maybe you actually want to run different scanner configurations, different rule sets across different repos. All right, well, you want to make sure you have an easy way to adjust those. You don't have to go and do this by hand every single time across hundreds of repos. And so now maybe you've set up a database with these config files, and you're pulling those in, and you're kind of connecting those for each single repository. Starting to get a little bit more complicated. But of course, right now this system is closed just to the developer. There's no way to aggregate results yet. There's no way for security insight. And so now maybe you actually build out a results database that's aggregating. So not only does security linter run and give feedback to developers, but now to give insights for your security team, it's going to shoot the results over to another database. Of course, you want to view those in a nice way. So now you're going to build a web app. You really want some nice reports, and you're going to build a reporting cron. And really quickly, it's easy to see where this setup can get more complicated than just, add Brakeman to your repo. I think it's easy to make these problems of orchestration, of scale, seem easier than they are. And this isn't like too complicated of a setup, but depending on the maturity of your organization, the maturity of your security team, how many people you have, this looks like a nightmare or this looks super simple. And this is where there's a lot of vendors in this space trying to help deal with a lot of these problems. And there's also open source solutions. There's the SAST project from Coinbase, which is all built around orchestration, deployment of security tooling across all your repos. Just to kind of review there, there's a lot that can be put in to setting up your security linter kind of like automation. Adding a linter to run on every single commit, pull request, and reporting all the findings, scaling it out to multiple new repos, updating configurations, getting security team feedback. Like, it can become a lot real quick. Okay, cool. So let's look at what a few of these things look like in practice. So I'm gonna go over three examples that I've seen that I think are worth talking about. The first one I'm gonna talk about is this gentleman, Clint Gibbler, and this tool, SemGrab. So if you're not familiar with Clint, definitely go check out the TLDRSec newsletter. It's a great newsletter. It's my go-to source just for keeping up with security information, keeping with security news. And so Clint is an incredible speaker, and he's given just dozens of talks. If you're looking for great security content and trying to understand what the state of the world is, go check out his RSA 2020 State of the Union, I believe. He spent so much time just collecting a ridiculous amount of data and sharing trends and how security is evolving. But for this slide, I want to talk about one specific presentation he had where he talked about this idea of invariance. So this term invariant, it just means that it's something that must either always or never be true. It's invariant. It doesn't change. A very simple idea, but it's got a really neat application when you start applying it to how you think about static analysis. I think it's really cool because it applies to this idea of the paved path. I think too often you can see that and you're like, okay, what does that mean in practice? Well, in practice, when applied with invariance, it can look, you can make it simpler on how you approach your kind of static analysis rule sets. So the one example, the canonical example that I love to use, and I think Clint uses in this presentation as well, is the React function dangerously set inner HTML. If dangerously set inner HTML, the function could collect royalties, I would owe it thousands of dollars for the amount of times I bring it up. But it's a great example. So for anyone who's not familiar, the front-end framework React does a really good job of solving the problem of cross-site scripting. By default, everything is output encoded, and so you can be very safe that even when you have these super malicious XSS payloads, that when they get output back to your web app, it's going to be safe. But the one of the biggest ways around it is with this function that's aptly named dangerously set inner HTML. And so what that means when we're talking about invariance is we can make an assertion if we're using this framework that we may not have been able to make otherwise. So without React, we might say, okay, ask the question, how would XSS, sort of an XSS vulnerability materialize in our app. Maybe you need to check the input that's coming in. Maybe do you have any sanitization going in? How are you storing it? What sort of is the format of the data? What's the context in which you're outputting the data? Kind of all of these questions, they're like, all right, let's go start creating some rules to check these things. You're checking like 8 different places for all these different things, all these options. But by using the React framework, you can make the statement that you won't have XSS in your app if there is no function calls to dangerously set enrich HTML. So if there is, you will always be protected against XSS if you can just simply remove that one function. And that's the power of an invariance. You just simplified what the things you need to check for are. Now, of course, it's not going to be totally true, right? There's a lot of edge cases. There's one particular setting like the href to use like JavaScript header on React is another way to get around that. And maybe you've got this other web app that is a side part of your organization. So, but it's what it's going to do is it's going to solve that big problem for you. And so that's a really powerful idea. It's this idea that Clint's talked about quite a bit, and that I learned from him. It helps you enforce the secure default really well. And that's something that motivated him to go work at the company SemGrep. So SemGrep, the company R2C, which has the product SemGrep. So SemGrep is a security linter. Right there, it's a lightweight static analysis. It's an open source tool, and it's very rad, and I would highly recommend you check it out if you haven't. A lot of people are talking about it, so wouldn't be surprised if everyone here has already kind of heard about it. A lot of community rules, so you can kind of get started out of the gate with a lot of things. But the thing I find most interesting about it is how easy it is to create custom rules with it, because everyone's code base is unique. Often, the pattern itself might not be so complicated within your code base if you're trying to like detect something. So for example, let's say authorization, right? Let's say you already have an authorization framework, permission system in your code base, and you just want to write a rule that says, okay, if I see any calls to these 10 database functions, right before it, I expect there to be a call to this authorization framework. Now, no security tool knows how to, or static analysis tool knows how to find that, right? They don't know your code base. They don't know what your authorization function is called, but that it's like really not that complicated of a rule. That's where something like SemGrep can come in super handy. But great, let them each come up with a simple way to define this. And even as I'll throw on here, they have you can define rules in SemGrep to have auto remediation, which is super neat. And so on the SemGrep website, they have this playground, and you can see here, this is their kind of example I was just talking about. So you can see in this top box, there says code is and is not. And what it's saying is, if you find a function and you see this thing make transaction, like there better be this other thing verified transaction right before it, which is the example I kind of just mentioned about authorization. And it's, as you can see there too, that's not some crazy pattern you have to write if you wanted to define this for your own code base. That's really a powerful part of SemGrep. You can use that then to start enforcing rules to try to find to support secure defaults and finding invariants. So as you can start defining, whether it's through frameworks, secure default, wrapping secure wrappers for stuff, so you start to define what those things are in your code base. You can start writing rules to start enforcing those. So the second example I want to talk about is my good friend John Melton and the company he works at, NetSuite. John always likes, whenever I would share the cool things we're building at Segment, he always loves to remind me that all problems are easy when you have two languages and one SCM. That if you have 3 SCMs and dozens of languages, all the problems are much more challenging to solve. And I always like to think about that as I'm building different security tools or internal stuff. So John had this really great talk recently at the Open Security Summit, where he was talking about how he was using SemGrep and other tools to power his security across his SDLC. And so namely, he gotten so deep into like how to leverage SemGrep that he was using it at all different steps of the SDLC. In this slide he had I think was a really great way of explaining each one of those steps. And so I'll just show in the next slide, he has different points at which he wants to run different types of rules. And so you can see at the bottom there, you got this asynchronous non-blocking one. So that's kind of his cron job, right? He's got a cron job running that's maybe running complicated tools, maybe he's running complex stuff that his security team is going to triage. And he's going to define the specific rule set in SemGrep that will run those specific ones. But then scooting up, he wants to run something a little bit faster. This is synchronous blocking. So this maybe it's like on each pull request, he's got a different set of rules. Maybe he's got a slightly higher confidence in them. Maybe he knows that these ones are going to work a little better. Maybe he's run them for a while. The maturity, the reliability of those rules. And as you go a little further up, you've got these code reviews. A little further up, he's even pushed it all the way into his IDE. We built a plugin for the IDE they use over at NetSuite, and he's got these really quick rules that he knows won't block developers. It's not going to take 30 seconds every time you edit your file. It's running immediately. That's like a really powerful way of taking. I think it's like a really strong emphasis on these, like the benefits of the trade-offs we made earlier. We traded off maximum coverage for speed. And so because of that, and in simplicity, we're able to put these things, static analysis, in places that would have been more cumbersome, I think, previously. And here's actually, he called out, this is his rule definition for SemGrep. And what's neat is he actually added his own metadata to a lot of this stuff. And so it's cool is that he leveraged this scope. He just added this scope attribute, and that would define which tools he wanted to run. And so when he has these SemGrep instances running different parts of his CI pipeline or his IDEs, they're all calling out to go fetch some rules, and it'll return all the rules, and it'll check the scope to see whether those rules apply to the situation they're in. He's got this status. He's going to use language to know whether the rules apply or not. SemGrep makes it easy to, I think, add a lot of this metadata to make sure like it fits the needs of your organization. One thing John mentioned in this talk as well is that he took a lot of the community rules, which were maybe too generic to be used effectively, but just by tweaking those simply, because that's SemGrep's empowering you to make quick modifications to them, he was able to take these generic rules and make them specific to his organization and made them much more effective. I think it's another way you can kind of look at these open source security linting tools and how it can be maybe more effective for what you're doing. And finally, I want to just talk about this company Afterpay. This is the last thing here. And so Afterpay, I don't know anyone at Afterpay. If someone knows someone at Afterpay, I would love to talk to them. I just found this blog post and I thought it was super rad. So Afterpay built a system of open source security linters and SCA, so what source composition analysis, so things like SNCC or Dependabot. It had built-in inline PR comments, and they used this GitHub Advanced Security feature, which we'll talk about. But this blog post, I would highly recommend you read it if any of the stuff I'm talking about is interesting you, just to pull one of the quotes from it. And there's a ton of good ones. It's just describing what their philosophy was for building this out. And there's so many things I've talked about on here, focusing on nude code first. The findings should be leading to fixes, because that's kind of what matters. Making it fast and kind of starting small and iterating. And this is the diagram from their blog post. You can see it's fairly simple. They have something like a GitHub action, perhaps triggering, kicking off these tools. Again, they're using SemGrep here. They're also using CodeQL and SNCC. And what's neat that in our diagram before, when we built out our own, and, we had to build these databases, reporting. What they did instead is they just shoved it all to this GitHub Advanced Security feature. And what this feature is it's kind of like a dashboard for all your security needs. And so if you have tools to output this format called serif, it's just a spec for static analysis tools. Hit ingest it all, and I'll start giving a lot of these results. So if you wanted to see like a really good example of how you can build out something like this on your own, I would highly recommend taking a look at that blog post. And that is it with just 1 minute over. So again, I will if you want the content of the slides or any of the references in there, I still need to just finalize all of the references. But I'm going to post these slides and make them available on Twitter, so you can find me at David_Scribonia. They'll all be there available.
There were a few questions. Which SAST tools do you find best, which can be integrated easily into the build pipeline? Do you have any recommendations for that?
Cool. If it wasn't obvious, kind of big shill for SemGrep. Loved that. That link I provided with a list of tools. There's too many on there, but there's some good ones. For Go, GoSec is pretty slick. Chekhov and TFSec for Terraform are pretty good. Cake is a new one out for infrastructure as code. That's pretty sweet. Brakeman is the de facto for Rails. There's a lot you can do with ESLint and various ESLint plugins, but there's kind of some messy ones that I don't like. And to be honest, a lot of these tools, a lot of the maintainers of them are, rewriting some of the rules in SemGrep just because it's easier for them to use that platform than building into something like ESLint.
There was another one. How have you achieved a low false positive rate with SAST tooling? That's been a major pain point with SAST in general.
Yeah, I think I addressed that question a few times with various things. Again, there's no silver bullet, right? You have to look at kind of like almost on a per rule basis. I don't recommend taking a SaaS product out of the box and just running it. Like, you will have that problem. So picking out rules, like having a few rules that are high impact for your organization are much more valuable than a bunch of rules that are kind of just producing noise. And depending on the rule, depending on the vuln class, some of them are going to be easier than not. But again, going with this idea of invariance, if you can enforce, if you know that there's like a secure way that you want your DB queries to run, that your auth things to happen, your output encoding, if you can get frameworks and these invariants, you can simplify the problem much more than trying to find all of the thing and trying to boil the ocean with that.
Perfect. Totally agree. If anyone else had questions, you can unmute or put them in the chat, and I don't mind asking David it. But thanks, David. That was super, super helpful. I love the security person with a top hat and a monocle. I think that was one of my favorite things in there. I do think us the security folks are kind of fancy, so definitely enjoyed that.
Oh, thanks, man. It's been a pleasure. If anyone has any questions, feel free to hit me on Twitter. Always love to talk about this stuff. Love nerd out about it. Thanks for having me, Jeevan.
Awesome. Thank you so much, David. All right. Again, if you have any additional questions, feel free to hit up David or myself on Twitter. Always, both of us really enjoy communicating with the community and just providing some of the insights that we've come across in our career. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, everyone. This was a great, another edition of OWASP Vancouver. Next month, we're going to have Flash Talks. So we traditionally have a lot of the newcomers into security do small Flash Talks. So if you're interested, I think we still have a couple of slots open. So if you're interested in sharing something, feel free to reach out, and then we'll see you all in August. Thank you all.